The Crooked Cabby, the mountain village of Pinewood Ridge, sat nestled in a valley where the snow fell soft and steady from November through April. The cabins dotted the hillside like wooden sentries, their roofs peaked and proud against the endless white landscape. Smoke curled from chimneys each evening, and the settlers who lived there had learned to read the mountain's moods the way sailors read the sea. Thomas Brennan was the newest arrival to Pinewood Ridge. He came in late autumn, just as the first serious snows began to fall. He was a quiet man with calloused hands and patient eyes, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once, who believed in doing things right even if it took longer. Thomas had purchased a small plot of land on the eastern edge of the settlement. It wasn't the best location, some of the other settlers told him. The slope was uneven there, and the wind came hard off the mountain peaks. But Thomas just smiled and nodded and began clearing the ground for his cabin. He worked slowly and deliberately through the shortening days. While the other settlers had hired help or worked in groups to raise their homes, Thomas worked alone. He studied the land carefully, walking the plot at different times of day, watching how the snow settled and where the wind pushed hardest. When he finally began building, the other settlers noticed something odd. Thomas's cabin was crooked. Not falling down crooked, but deliberately, purposefully angled. The walls didn't meet the ground at the usual right angles. Instead, the entire structure leaned into the mountain, as if the cabin were bowing to something greater than itself. "What in the world is Thomas doing over there?" Martha Henderson asked her husband one evening as they watched the strange construction take shape. "Building a cabin for drunks, looks like," her husband replied with a chuckle. "Things more tilted than a ship in a storm." The joke spread through Pinewood Ridge like butter on warm bread. At the general store, folks would shake their heads and wonder aloud what Thomas had been thinking. Some suggested he didn't know how to use a level. Others figured he was just peculiar, one of those odd mountain men who preferred solitude to sense. "Thomas," called out Jacob Morrison one afternoon, "you know your cabin's leaning something fierce, don't you?" Thomas looked up from where he was fitting logs together with careful precision.
"I know," he said simply. "Well, aren't you going to fix it?"
"Nothing to fix," Thomas replied. "It's built exactly as I planned." Jacob walked away shaking his head, and that evening the story made its rounds through every cabin in the settlement. Thomas Brennan's crooked cabin became the talk of Pinewood Ridge. Children giggled when they passed it. Women clucked their tongues. Men made wagers about when it would finally tip over completely, but Thomas paid them no mind. He continued his work with the same patient care he'd shown from the beginning. He reinforced the joints with extra pins. He built the roof at that same peculiar angle, slanting back toward the mountain. He even constructed his porch with a tilt, so that standing on it felt like leaning into a strong wind. By the time the deep winter arrived, Thomas had moved into his crooked cabin. Smoke rose from his chimney just like all the others. Light glowed from his windows in the evening. And if his floors weren't quite level, well, Thomas didn't seem to mind. The winter settled in hard that year. The snow piled high against every cabin, and the settlers spent their days keeping their roofs clear and their paths open. The mountain loomed above them all, ancient and indifferent, wearing its crown of snow and ice. Thomas spent his evenings reading by lamplight, his chair positioned to compensate for the cabin's tilt. Sometimes he would stand at his window and look up at the mountain peaks, watching, waiting, listening to something the others couldn't hear. It happened on a Tuesday in late February. The day had dawned clear and cold, with that peculiar stillness that sometimes comes to mountain valleys. The air felt pressed down, heavy with something unspoken. Thomas woke early that morning and stood on his crooked porch, studying the peaks above. Then he did something that no one in Pinewood Ridge had ever done before. He went door to door, knocking urgently, his face serious but calm. "You need to leave," he told each family. "Take what you can carry and get to the lower valley, now." "What are you talking about?" Jacob Morrison demanded. "It's the middle of winter. The mountain's going to let go," Thomas said quietly. "I've been watching the snowpack. It's unstable. We need to get everyone to safety." Most folks dismissed him. Crazy Thomas with his crooked cabin, now he was predicting disaster. But something in his eyes made a few families pause. Martha Henderson remembered how carefully he'd studied the land before building. She gathered her children and convinced her husband to follow Thomas's advice. By noon, perhaps a third of the settlement had reluctantly made their way to the lower valley, mostly out of uncertainty rather than belief. The rest stayed in their warm cabins, confident in their sturdy walls and straight angles. Thomas was the last to leave. He stood on his crooked porch one final time, looking at his cabin with something like affection. Then he turned and walked down the mountain path. The avalanche came at dusk. It started with a sound like distant thunder, then grew into a roar that shook the valley. A massive wall of snow broke free from the peaks above Pinewood Ridge, gathering speed and power as it descended. It swept through the settlement like a white wave, overwhelming everything in its path. When the snow finally settled and the survivors made their way back up the mountain, they found devastation. Cabin after cabin had been crushed or buried or swept away entirely. Straight walls and proper angles had offered no protection against the mountain's fury. But there, still standing amid the destruction, was Thomas Brennan's crooked cabin. Its odd angles had let the avalanche flow around it rather than through it. Its lean into the mountain had given the snow a path of less resistance. Every strange choice Thomas had made, every tilted wall and slanted beam, had been designed for this moment. The settlers stood in silence, staring at the only home still standing. No one laughed now. No one made jokes about drunken construction or peculiar angles. Thomas walked up the path to his cabin and stood before it. The structure had held. His understanding of the mountain, his patient observation, his willingness to build differently despite the mockery, had all been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. "How did you know?" Martha Henderson asked softly. Thomas looked up at the peaks above, now peaceful again in the fading light. "My grandfather was a mountain man," he said. "He taught me to listen to what the land was saying. Sometimes the crooked path is the one that survives. Sometimes what looks wrong to others is actually right for where you stand." In the days that followed, the survivors rebuilt Pinewood Ridge. But this time, they built differently. They asked Thomas for advice. They studied the land more carefully. They learned that strength isn't always about standing straight and proud, but sometimes about knowing when to bend, when to lean, when to let the mountain's power flow around you rather than through you. And Thomas Brennan's crooked cabin stood at the heart of it all, a testament to wisdom over convention, patience over speed, and the quiet courage of building what you know is right, even when the whole world calls you wrong.